I am Claire, 26 years old, junior associate attorney. They changed the locks on a Tuesday, threw my bar prep books onto the wet pavement, refused to co-sign my loans, ignored my calls from the emergency room. For 4 years, I was just a ghost occupying empty space. Now, the air conditioning in courtroom 4B hums a dull drone. My parents sit at the defense table, bankrupt, facing felony fraud charges, sweating through cheap polyester. I walk through the oak doors. I do not speak. I simply place a manila folder on the prosecutor's desk. The label reads, Audio Evidence. My mother's eyes lock onto the file. Her breathing hitches into sharp, shallow rasps. The skin around her collarbone flushes into an ugly, uneven ash. Before I open this file, hit subscribe. Do it only if you understand the heavy cost of a severed bloodline. Drop your current city in the comments. Let me know where the jury is sitting as I present Exhibit A. The gavel hasn't dropped yet. We need to rewind the tape. 4 years before the polyester suits and the courtroom hum. I lived in a converted garage in Astoria. The landlord called it a garden studio. It was a concrete box with a single barred window. Rent was $840 a month. The exposed pipes screamed whenever the upstairs neighbor turned on the hot water. I slept on a twin-sized foam pad directly on the cement floor. No frame, no sheets, just a scratchy olive-green wool blanket I bought at a military surplus store for $9. My desk was a warped sheet of plywood balanced on 2 stacked milk crates. I was preparing for the New York State bar examination. Every single cent was documented in a cheap, water-damaged ledger. $250 for the application fee, $45 for the mandatory background check fingerprinting, $12.30 a week for bulk dry lentils, plain white rice, and store-brand black tea bags. I reused the tea bags until the water was virtually clear. I did not consume meat. I did not buy fresh fruit. I did not buy winter boots. When the February slush hit the pavement, I wrapped my feet in plastic grocery bags before putting on my worn-out black loafers. The soles were patched with electrical tape. My parents lived in a 5-bedroom modern farmhouse in Greenwich. They drove current-year luxury SUVs. They drank imported Bordeaux on weeknights. They funded my older brother's out-of-state tuition without blinking. Mason was a communications major. He failed 4 core classes. He totaled 2 sedans. They bought him a jet ski to help with his seasonal depression. I asked them for a loan exactly once, just for the bar prep software and a set of used textbooks. $1,400. My father laughed. It was a dry, scraping sound, like sandpaper on glass. He leaned back in his leather recliner. He told me I was wasting my time. He told me female lawyers end up bitter, neurotic, and unlovable. My mother nodded, taking a slow sip of her espresso. They operated an independent commercial real estate appraisal firm. They routinely inflated property values for shady developers. They secured massive, unwarranted loans. It was an open secret within our walls. They wanted me to drop out of law school. They wanted me to manage their books, to sign off on the financial discrepancies, to be their in-house legal shield. I refused. I packed my belongings into 2 heavy-duty garbage bags and left in the middle of the night. That refusal was a declaration of war. They immediately cut off my phone plan. They removed me from their health insurance. But they didn't just walk away. They watched. They waited in the periphery. My mother has a specific physiological tell when she is plotting. Most people miss it. She nods in perfect sympathy. She speaks in soft, musical, hushed tones. But you have to watch her hands. Her left thumb rubs aggressive, rhythmic circles against the knuckle of her index finger. A steady, pulsing friction. Her eyes undergo a terrifying shift. The warmth drains out completely. The pupils contract into tiny black points. The sympathy on her face hardens into a rigid ceramic mask. The smile stops abruptly at her teeth. It never reaches the muscles of her cheeks. She exhibited this tell at Thanksgiving. I had made the mistake of attending out of a misplaced sense of obligation. I was exhausted. The skin under my eyes was bruised purple from lack of sleep. My collarbones protruded sharply against my cheap, oversized sweater. The spine of my contracts and torts textbook had split entirely, and I had spent hours taping it back together. I was hollowed out. I foolishly mentioned I was applying to top-tier civil litigation firms, mid-sized practices in Manhattan. My mother poured hot gravy over Mason's mashed potatoes. She asked me for the names of the firms, just to keep them in her prayers, she claimed, just to manifest good energy for her only daughter. Her thumb rubbed circles against her knuckle. 1, 2, 3. She was taking inventory. She was collecting targets. I recited the list. I was starved for maternal validation. I handed her the ammunition on a silver platter. January arrived. The interview season commenced. I wore a thrift store blazer that cost exactly $14. It smelled faintly of old mothballs and damp basement. I had scrubbed the fabric with a baking soda paste for 3 consecutive nights. I ironed it using a heated frying pan from the stove because I couldn't afford an iron. My academic record was a fortress. Top 8% of my graduating class. Executive editor of the University Law Review. Moot court champion. The initial phone screenings went flawlessly. Your credentials are outstanding, Claire. We are very eager to bring you in for a final partner round. You are precisely the candidate we need for this associate position. And then, a deafening, absolute silence. The final round interviews were abruptly canceled. The automated emails stopped. Direct phone calls went straight to automated voicemails, 19 applications, 14 preliminary interviews, 0 offers. I checked my email inbox every 15 minutes. My stomach was a permanent tight knot of battery acid. The acid crept up and burned the back of my throat. I chewed generic antacid tablets like they were mints. The chalky, artificial berry flavor coated my tongue. My hairline was slick with cold, nervous sweat. My highlighter had run dry, and I had pressed so hard into my notes that the paper tore. Something was systematically wrong. Law firms ghost applicants occasionally, but never like this. Not unilaterally, not after scheduling final in-person partner interviews. The rejections were not standard form letters. They were sudden, cold, and legally guarded. In late February, I called the human resources director at a mid-tier firm in the financial district, a woman named Beatrice. I threw away my pride. I begged for feedback. I told her I needed to know what went wrong. Beatrice sighed. A heavy, uncomfortable sound through the receiver. Claire, we received a phone call from a woman claiming to be your previous employer and your mother. She provided a highly detailed account of corporate embezzlement. She stated that felony charges were currently pending. We cannot take that risk. I'm sorry. I tried to speak. My jaw locked. The muscles in my neck tightened until it felt like thick piano wire snapping under pressure. It's a lie, I whispered, but the line was already dead. The dial tone buzzed against my ear, the pieces fully locked into place 2 weeks later. It culminated at my cousin's wedding reception in early March. A rented banquet hall in New Jersey. Faux crystal chandeliers casting harsh yellow light. The distinct smell of overcooked prime rib and stale champagne. I was seated at the overflow table near the swinging kitchen doors. I was cutting into a dry piece of chicken. My phone vibrated against my thigh. An email notification from the managing partner of Sterling Hayes and Vance, my absolute dream firm, the one I had prepared 80 hours for. I opened the email under the tablecloth. Dear Ms. Claire, we are formally retracting our interview invitation. We take our firm's reputation and integrity seriously. Pending criminal investigations, specifically involving financial fraud, are a direct violation of our ethical standards. Do not contact this office or our personnel again. My lungs instantly seized. The oxygen evaporated from the banquet hall. Pending criminal investigations, financial fraud. I had never even received a late fee on a library book. I had absolutely zero criminal record. I forced my head up. The room spun slightly. Across the dance floor, my mother was watching me. She was standing perfectly still beside a melting swan ice sculpture. She held a flute of Prosecco. Her left thumb was rubbing violent circles against her index finger knuckle. She tilted her glass toward me, a micromillimeter of a toast. She had spoken to my aunt moments before. She knew exactly what she was doing. The acoustics in the hall carried her voice perfectly over the clinking silverware and the smooth jazz cover band. "It's an absolute tragedy about Claire," she projected, her voice laced with synthetic grief. "We tried to raise her with morals, but theft is a disease. She stole from our clients. She forged our signatures. We caught her trying to wire funds to an offshore account. It breaks a mother's heart to report her own flesh and blood. But the law is the law. We couldn't let her infect those prestigious law firms. She has a police record now. Grand larceny. We had to warn those law firms. As upstanding business owners, we had a moral and civic duty to call their human resources departments and tell them the truth about our own daughter." The ambient noise in the room evaporated. Forks paused midair. 60 pairs of eyes snapped toward the overflow table near the kitchen. My aunt covered her mouth in dramatic horror. Mason smirked over his plate of prime rib. The blood drained from my face. My fingers went completely numb, dropping the fork onto the porcelain plate with a sharp clatter. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. The dry chicken turned to sharp glass in my throat. My pulse pounded against my eardrums. A deafening, brutal thud. They didn't just want me to fail. They had called every single firm on my list. They had impersonated concerned parents and defrauded employers. They had fabricated a criminal record to salt the earth of my legal career. They wanted me destitute, destroyed, and crawling back to their fraudulent empire on my knees. The room watched me burn. I did not cry. I did not scream. The muscles in my legs felt like lead. I slowly pushed my chair back. The metal legs scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor. I stood up. I walked toward the exit. I could feel the heat of their stares on the back of my neck. My mother took another sip of her Prosecco. Her smile was a razor blade. She thought she had won. She thought she had effectively severed every lifeline I had to the outside world. She thought I would be calling her the next morning, begging for a job at the appraisal firm. She miscalculated. The metal doors of the banquet hall slammed shut behind me. The cold New Jersey air hit my face like microscopic shards of glass. I did not have a winter coat. I walked 3.2 miles to the nearest transit station in those taped-up loafers. The entire train ride back to Astoria, I stared at the dirty linoleum floor of the subway car. My mind was a terrifying, absolute blank. The next morning, the survival instinct hijacked my nervous system. The analytical legal brain forcefully took the wheel. I compiled a 74-page physical dossier. I included certified copies of my pristine criminal background check from the State Police Division. I printed my official university transcripts. I gathered notarized affidavits of character from 3 senior law professors. I printed 6 months of bank statements showing a near-zero balance, proving absolutely no large wire transfers or hidden escrow deposits. I went to a local internet cafe that smelled of stale tobacco and energy drinks. I spent my last $14.50 on the printer, ink, and binding. I drafted a formal legal summary. I did not threaten. I explained the situation with clinical precision. I stated that a rumor of felony grand larceny would effectively ban me from practicing law in the state of New York. I placed the massive stack of paper into a heavy-duty cardboard mailer. I shipped it via priority, certified mail to my parents' residential address. Then, I dialed the phone. I called my mother's personal cell. The automated carrier voice informed me the number was unreachable. I called the appraisal firm's landline. The receptionist, a woman named Carol, who had known me since I was 8 years old, picked up. The second I stated my name, the line went dead. A sharp click, followed by the dial tone. I dialed my father's direct office extension 38 times in 4 days. He never picked up. On the 5th day, the cardboard mailer was forcefully wedged into my rusted apartment mailbox. Slashed across the front, stamped in thick permanent red ink. Return to sender. Refused. Unable to forward. I opened my laptop. I attempted to email a digital PDF copy of the dossier to my father's work address. A gray banner instantly popped up on my screen. Message blocked by recipient server. They did not just lock the front door, they systematically erased my digital and physical footprint from their reality. They built a soundproof, concrete wall around my vocal cords. A sharp, localized pressure settled directly behind my sternum. It felt like a heavy, iron block pressing down on my lungs. The nerve endings in my fingertips went completely numb, as if submerged in a bucket of ice water. My vision tunneled, the edges of the room dissolving into static gray noise. I crawled onto the bare mattress pad. I pulled the scratchy wool blanket over my head. I pulled my knees tightly against my chest to stop the violent shaking vibrating through my femur bones. I grabbed a plastic bucket and dry-heaved stomach acid until a harsh metallic taste coated the back of my tongue. The next 7 months were a masterclass in extreme isolating deprivation. The state bar exam results were delayed. I needed to survive the waiting period. I took a night shift job cleaning an industrial warehouse complex in Queens. $4.50 an hour, paid in cash inside a small manila envelope every Friday. I survived on dented, expired cans of generic kidney beans. I bought them for 20 cents each from a discount rack at a corner bodega. I ate them cold, straight from the tin with a cracked plastic spoon. My single-coil electric hot plate had short-circuited weeks prior, scorching a black mark into the baseboard. I stole half-used rolls of industrial, translucent toilet paper from the gas station restroom down the street. I washed my clothes in the bathroom sink using a stolen bottle of pink, industrial hand soap. I wrung the heavy fabrics out until the joints in my wrists ached with a dull, throbbing heat. I hung the wet clothes over the shower curtain rod. The dampness made the apartment smell permanently like wet dog and bleach. My weight plummeted. The skin over my cheekbones stretched tight and translucent. It took on a sickly yellowish hue under the single flickering fluorescent bulb of my studio. At 2 a.m, my back pressed against the freezing cinder block wall of my makeshift closet, I read my legal textbooks. I used a tiny battery-operated headlamp strapped to my forehead. I memorized the penal codes for corporate fraud. I dissected every known loophole in commercial real estate financing. I did not weep. The tear ducts were entirely dry. In their place, a cold, dense block of titanium formed at the base of my spine. It anchored me to the floor. Then, a thin white envelope arrived. The New York State Board of Law Examiners. Pass. I was officially an attorney. I did not celebrate. I did not buy a cup of coffee. I walked straight to the Queens County District Attorney's office. I bypassed the luxury corporate firms entirely. I submitted my resume directly to the Economic Crimes Bureau. They desperately needed junior prosecutors. They needed hungry, desperate associates willing to work 80-hour weeks for a fraction of private sector compensation. They needed someone who thoroughly understood the granular, agonizingly tedious mechanics of financial deception. They hired me on a probationary basis. I wore a clearance rack gray skirt suit. It was 2 sizes too large. I had to pin the waistband of the skirt with a large metal safety pin, hidden carefully beneath the suit jacket. I was assigned to a windowless sub-basement office that smelled of decaying paper and ozone from the copy machine. But I had a badge. I had an official government email address ending in .gov. And most importantly, I possessed legal subpoena power. My very first personal target was not my parents. It was Beatrice, the human resources director at the financial district law firm who had rejected me over the phone. I did not call her. I drafted a formal Article 31 pre-action disclosure demand. I printed it on heavy stock district attorney letterhead. I cited an ongoing classified investigation into coordinated corporate defamation and interstate wire fraud. I formally requested the preservation and immediate transfer of all external communications, including audio logs, regarding my applicant file. Beatrice's legal department panicked. 3 days later, a thick padded manila envelope arrived on my desk. Inside was a silver Kingston USB drive and a printed memorandum. The memo legally verified that standard firm policy dictated the automatic recording of all external HR phone lines for compliance and liability purposes. I plugged the silver drive into my secure government terminal. I plugged in my cheap wired headphones. I clicked play on the audio file. A brief hiss of static. Then, my mother's voice filled my ears. It was crystalline, digitally perfect, dripping with that synthetic, agonizingly polite maternal concern. Yes, Beatrice, it is just devastating. As her mother, I feel morally compelled to protect your prestigious firm. Claire has a severe, untreated problem. The authorities are heavily involved. She embezzled exactly $75,000 from our corporate escrow accounts. We are pressing felony charges on Monday morning. Please, for your own liability and safety, discard her application immediately. My father's voice chimed in through a speakerphone in their background. She is a massive liability, ma'am. We just want to do the right thing for the legal community. The tendons in my neck pulled so tight they threatened to snap. The acid in my stomach violently pushed up into my esophagus. The veins on the back of my hands bulged against my pale skin. They had not just exaggerated a flaw. They had meticulously fabricated a highly specific dollar amount. They had engineered a fictional legal event designed to trigger automatic rejection from every risk-averse law firm in the state. Pause the playback for a second. Have you ever sat completely alone in a freezing room, listening to the exact people who created you actively dismantle your future? Have you ever felt the cold, hard reality of being erased by your own bloodline? Watching them steal your voice and hand you a script of criminal guilt you never wrote? If you have ever survived a coordinated smear campaign, if you have ever had your reputation slaughtered behind closed doors while you were fighting in the dirt just to stay alive, go down to the comments right now. Type the word evidence. Drop that word as a marker of your survival and keep the audio playing because the tape does not stop here, and neither did I. I exported the audio file. I saved it to 3 separate encrypted external hard drives. I locked one in a bank safety deposit box. I did not leak the audio. I did not drive to Greenwich to confront them. A warning shot is a wasted bullet. Instead, I redirected my absolute focus to my actual job, economic crimes. I began pulling public property tax records in Greenwich. I utilized specialized law enforcement software to run the complex web of limited liability companies associated with my parents' appraisal firm. I meticulously cross-referenced the property values they had formally assessed against the actual, verified market data. I spent consecutive nights sleeping under my metal desk on a thin yoga mat, surviving on stale vending machine crackers and tap water. I found the structural rot. They were not just petty thieves making exaggerated claims. They were the architects of a systematic, multi-million-dollar commercial valuation fraud ring. They were artificially inflating commercial warehouse and strip mall values by 300%. This allowed shady shell companies to secure massive, unsecured bank loans. My parents were quietly taking a 20% kickback for providing the fraudulent, legally binding appraisals. It was a federal-level offense, but our state office maintained concurrent jurisdiction over the financial institutions involved. I compiled the raw data. A massive, undeniable mountain of it. 3,400 pages of forged signatures, phantom properties, manipulated environmental reports, and offshore wire transfers. I built the matrix on a massive corkboard in my basement office, connecting the red string like a spider webbing its prey. I brought the massive file to the bureau chief, a hard-nosed, cynical veteran named Callahan. He spent 4 uninterrupted hours reading my financial analysis. When he finally finished, he slowly took off his reading glasses. He looked directly at me. He saw the cold, dead, absolute focus radiating from my pupils. He authorized the arrest warrants immediately. The raid occurred on a rainy Thursday morning. I was not present. I read the tactical police report later that afternoon. The state police raided the modern farmhouse in Greenwich at dawn. They seized both current-year luxury SUVs. They froze every single bank account associated with their names and businesses. They impounded the jet ski. They dragged my parents out onto the wet pavement in handcuffs, in full view of the entire manicured, wealthy neighborhood. The local news stations broadcasted the footage on a continuous loop. The Chiron read, "Prominent real estate appraisers indicted in $12 million fraud scheme." Their fraudulent empire evaporated into ash overnight. The shell companies instantly flipped on them to save themselves, providing state prosecutors with direct witness testimony. Their high-priced defense attorneys demanded a massive upfront retainer, which my parents could no longer afford because every cent of their assets was frozen under state seizure laws. They were forced to accept court-appointed public defenders, overworked, exhausted attorneys who barely had the time to skim the massive indictments. For 2 agonizing years, the pre-trial motions dragged through the overloaded court system. I stayed entirely in the shadows. I quietly requested a transfer to the specific prosecution team assigned to their criminal case. I was the junior associate, the invisible ghost in the paperwork. I drafted the subpoenas. I organized the physical exhibits. I ensured every single procedural loophole was welded permanently shut. My parents had absolutely no idea I was on the case. My name was buried on page 4 of the prosecution's dense legal filings, listed only as C. Miller, Associate Counsel. They were too busy panicking over their impending financial and personal ruin to read the fine print. Then, the official trial date arrived. The morning of the trial, I woke up at exactly 5 a.m. I did not put on a clearance rack skirt. I did not put on taped-up loafers. I wore a custom-tailored charcoal gray wool suit. The fabric was heavy, structured, and immaculate. It cost $800, paid in cash from my savings. The heels of my leather pumps clicked with sharp, absolute authority against the hardwood floor of my new apartment. I drank a single cup of black coffee. The liquid was hot, bitter, and grounding. I walked to the county courthouse. The March wind whipped aggressively against my face, but I did not register the cold. I felt only the slow, steady, mechanical drumbeat of inevitability. My pulse was a metronome, perfectly calibrated to the destruction I was about to deliver. I rode the elevator to the 4th floor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a dull electrical hum. The air smelled of floor wax, cheap cologne, and stale anxiety. I stopped outside the heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4B. The brass handle was freezing against my palm. I could hear the muffled voices inside, the frantic shuffling of legal pads, the quiet, desperate, panicked murmurs coming from the defense table. I closed my eyes. I took one long, deep breath. The oxygen filled the very bottom of my lungs, expanding the ribcage that used to ache from starvation. I turned the brass handle and pushed the doors open. The hinges of the oak doors groaned, a low, drawn-out scrape against the sudden silence of Courtroom 4B. The gallery was packed with aggressive local reporters, a half-dozen junior partners from the very same Manhattan law firms that had rejected me sat in the back row, sent to observe the spectacular collapse of their former commercial clients. The air was stale, thick with tension and the smell of industrial floor polish. I walked down the center aisle. My posture was a steel rod. My customized charcoal suit absorbed the harsh fluorescent glare. I did not look at the defense table. I kept my eyes locked onto the prosecutor's desk. Senior Assistant District Attorney Callahan was already seated, organizing a massive stack of manila folders. I pulled out the heavy wooden chair beside him. The legs squeaked sharply against the linoleum. I sat down, opened my leather briefcase, and placed a single silver USB drive on top of my legal pad. Callahan leaned over. "You good, Miller?" I nodded once, a microscopic mechanical movement. "Ready." Across the room, the defense table descended into a chaotic, muted panic. My parents were crammed next to their overworked public defender, a young man who looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. They were both wearing identical cheap polyester suits, likely purchased off a clearance rack after the state froze their assets. The fabric bunched awkwardly at their shoulders. Their skin was a sickening, sallow gray. The imported Bordeaux flush was entirely gone. My mother's head snapped up at the sound of my chair pulling back. It took her precisely 4 seconds to process the visual information. The immaculate suit. The proximity to the senior district attorney. The sheer, terrifying stillness of my presence on the opposing side of the room. Her jaw literally unhinged, the muscles in her neck corded into tight, visible bands. The frantic, aggressive rubbing of her left thumb against her knuckle stopped dead. Her hands fell limp onto the table. Her breathing hitched into rapid, shallow gasps, a physical manifestation of total, absolute terror. My father gripped the edge of the defense table so hard, his knuckles turned a mottled purple. He stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The sandpaper laugh was gone. In its place, a horrific realization settled heavily over his hunched shoulders. I did not smile. I did not blink. I stared back with the cold, dead eyes of an apex predator evaluating a wounded animal. I was not their daughter anymore. I was the state's most lethal asset. "All rise," the bailiff barked, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Judge Harrison took the bench, a no-nonsense, deeply cynical woman who despised white-collar crime. She adjusted her reading glasses and slammed the gavel down once. The sharp crack made my mother flinch violently. The initial pretrial motions began. The public defender stumbled through a desperate plea to suppress the electronic evidence from the offshore accounts, arguing a technicality regarding the search warrant's scope. It was a weak, flailing attempt. Callahan stood up. He calmly dismantled the argument, citing 3 distinct federal precedents. But then, he paused. He looked back at me. "Your Honor, the state wishes to have Associate Counsel Miller summarize the financial tracing methodology used to link the shell companies to the defendants. She compiled the core data matrix." The entire courtroom shifted focus. The reporters leaned forward. The junior partners from the Manhattan firms whispered urgently to each other. I stood up. My voice was a flat, even, unyielding baritone. It cut through the stale air like a scalpel. "Your Honor, the prosecution's exhibit binders, sections 4 through 9, contain the comprehensive forensic accounting ledgers. The defendants utilized a layered network of 7 distinct limited liability companies, registered in Delaware, to obscure the origin of their fraudulent appraisal fees. The funds were then systematically routed through a series of microtransactions, each under the $10,000 federal reporting threshold, directly into personal escrow accounts controlled exclusively by the defendants. I did not use their names. I did not say my parents. I referred to them strictly as the defendants. This process, commonly known as smurfing, directly correlates with the deliberately inflated commercial property valuations provided by their firm. The mathematical probability of this occurring organically is statistically 0. My father suddenly stood up, his chair scraping violently backward. "She's lying. She has a vendetta. You can't let her do this." His voice was high, thin, and terrified. Judge Harrison banged her gavel, a rapid, aggressive burst. Sit down immediately, Mr. Defendant, or I will hold you in contempt and have you removed from my courtroom. Your counsel speaks for you. One more outburst and you spend the trial in a holding cell. My father collapsed back into his chair, breathing heavily. The public defender buried his face in his hands. I did not react. I remained standing, my face a mask of absolute professional indifference. I waited exactly 4 seconds for the silence to return. Furthermore, Your Honor, the state has additional evidence regarding the defendant's character and their willingness to engage in deliberate, coordinated defamation to protect this fraudulent enterprise. Callahan handed me the manila folder labeled Audio Evidence. I walked to the evidence clerk and formally submitted the silver USB drive. We are entering into evidence a recorded phone call, legally obtained via subpoena from Sterling, Hayes & Vance, a private law firm in Manhattan. My mother's head snapped toward me, her eyes wide with a sudden, localized panic. She recognized the firm's name. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together in her brain. The clerk connected the drive to the courtroom's central audio system. I pressed play. The hiss of static filled the room. Then, my mother's voice boomed through the speakers, amplified and inescapable. Yes, Beatrice, it is just devastating. As her mother, I feel morally compelled to protect your prestigious firm. Claire has a severe, untreated problem. The authorities are heavily involved. She embezzled exactly $75,000 from our corporate escrow accounts. We are pressing felony charges on Monday morning. Please, for your own liability and safety, discard her application immediately. The courtroom erupted. A collective gasp echoed from the gallery. The reporters furiously typed on their laptops. The junior partners from Manhattan stared at the defense table in sheer, unadulterated horror. They were witnessing a level of parental malice that defied basic human comprehension. My mother physically shrank in her chair. The ceramic mask completely shattered. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her cheap foundation. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. She was entirely broken, exposed, and humiliated on a massive, public scale. I paused the recording. The silence was deafening. Your Honor, I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet room. This audio demonstrates a calculated, premeditated willingness to fabricate felony charges against their own blood relative to silence potential whistleblowers. It establishes a clear, undeniable pattern of malicious fraud. Judge Harrison stared at the defendants with open disgust. She slowly took off her glasses. Admitted. Proceed, Ms. Miller. I walked back to the prosecution table. I sat down. The execution was flawless, but I was not finished. Just as the public defender stood up to frantically object to the audio's relevance, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open again. A tall, distinguished man with silver hair walked in. He wore a sharp, navy blue tailored suit. It was Arthur Vance, the senior managing partner of Sterling, Hayes & Vance. The very man whose firm had brutally rejected my application based on the fabricated phone call. He walked directly to the prosecution's table. He completely ignored the defense. He leaned down and placed a heavy, sealed envelope on my desk. Ms. Miller, Arthur Vance said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. I sincerely apologize for interrupting these proceedings, but I felt it was absolutely necessary to deliver this personally. He turned to address Judge Harrison. Your Honor, forgive the intrusion. I am Arthur Vance. My firm was the recipient of that fraudulent phone call. We conducted our own internal investigation after Ms. Miller contacted our HR department with her Article 31 demand. He turned back to me, extending his hand. Ms. Miller, on behalf of the entire partnership at Sterling, Hayes & Vance, we formally offer you a position as a senior associate in our corporate litigation division. Your investigative work on this specific fraud case is the most brilliant, relentless legal strategy we have seen in a decade. We want you on our team. The starting salary is $240,000, effective immediately upon the conclusion of this trial. The entire courtroom froze. The air was sucked out of the room. My father let out a low, pathetic whimper. My mother stared at Arthur Vance, her eyes glazed over with shock. The reality of the situation crushed them entirely. They had tried to destroy me. They had tried to bury me in concrete and starvation. Instead, they had unwittingly forged me into a weapon that annihilated their entire existence and secured me a highly coveted position at the exact firm they had weaponized against me. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply took the sealed envelope, placed it inside my leather briefcase, and nodded sharply. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," I said quietly. "I accept." I turned my attention back to the legal pad. The defendants were irrelevant now. The trial was a mere formality. The sentence was inevitable. The gavel struck the sound block, finalizing the morning recess. I remained in my chair. I organized my notes into perfect right-angled stacks. Wait. Stop right there. We are at a critical, psychological crossroads. You are the jury now. Look down at the defense table. How does a cornered, manipulative predator react when the cage permanently locks? Look at the options. Option A. They double down on the aggressive lies and physically attack the judge. Option B. They instantly turn on their own spouse to secure a reduced sentence. Option C. They fabricate a sudden, dramatic medical emergency to halt the courtroom machinery. Drop your verdict in the comments right now. Tell me which option you choose. And hit that subscribe button immediately, because the absolute systemic collapse of this fraudulent empire is about to unfold in real time. My mother chose a variation of option C, mixed with a desperate delusion. The courtroom emptied slightly. The bailiff stepped toward the outer hallway. My mother shoved past her overworked public defender. She lunged toward the prosecution table. She did not reach me. A heavy wooden partition separated us. Her physical state was degrading rapidly under the pressure. The capillaries in her cheeks had burst, leaving tiny, jagged purple webs across her skin. The sickly sweet smell of her expensive designer perfume had soured into the distinct, sharp odor of raw cortisol, panic, and stale sweat. "Claire," she rasped. Her voice was a wet, heavy wheeze. "Claire, listen to me. I have an arterial blockage. My heart is failing. The doctor said the stress of this trial will literally kill me. We did this for you, to teach you severe resilience, to make you a shark. You are a shark now, sweetheart. You won the game. Now just drop the state charges, please. I am your mother. I am dying." She reached her shaking hand over the wooden partition. Her manicured fingernails dug into the polished wood, desperately trying to bridge the physical gap between us. I did not flinch. I did not speak. I simply stared at the jagged purple webs on her cheeks. I observed her physiological breakdown with clinical, detached fascination. A set of heavy, uncoordinated footsteps echoed behind her. It was not a court officer. It was Mason, my older brother, the golden child. He looked entirely different. He wore a wrinkled, unwashed gray hoodie. His eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by deep, hollow, exhausted craters. He held a thick stack of printed papers clamped tightly in his fist. He did not look at our mother. He walked directly to the prosecution table. He slammed the stack of papers down right next to my neat, right-angled legal notes. "State's evidence," Mason muttered. His voice was completely hollow, stripped of all the arrogant, careless entitlement he carried at that New Jersey wedding reception. My mother's hand snapped back from the partition. Her eyes widened. "Mason? What are you doing here? You should be at home." He finally turned to look at her. His face was a mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. "Saving myself from you." He looked at Ada Callahan. "Those are the internal company emails and text message logs, extracted from a prepaid burner phone they kept hidden inside the kitchen pantry. They knew the federal auditors were closing in 6 months ago. They drafted a contingency plan, a legal narrative to frame me as the primary architect of the shell companies. They were going to use my failed communications degree as proof that I mishandled the marketing and banking documents. They were going to feed me to the Economic Crimes Bureau to secure a leniency deal for themselves. My mother's mouth opened, but only a dry, clicking sound emerged from her throat. The final delusion of maternal sacrifice instantly vaporized. She had attempted to sacrifice her designated scapegoat. When the scapegoat escaped into the night, she calmly and methodically prepared to slaughter her golden child on the altar of her own survival. I did not say a single word. I let the printed emails sit on the heavy oak table. The black ink on the white paper was absolute, undeniable, and fatal. I let the silence in the courtroom perform the execution. I let my mother listen to the sound of her own carefully constructed universe cracking, splintering, and collapsing into microscopic dust. The fallout was immediate. The dominoes did not just fall, they disintegrated upon impact. The introduction of Mason's burner phone logs shattered the final fragile remnants of their legal defense. The public defender formally advised them to accept an unconditional guilty plea to avoid a 20-year maximum sentence. They took the plea the following Tuesday morning. The second the plea was entered, the betrayal accelerated. My father immediately attempted to sever his case from my mother's during the sentencing phase. He filed a sworn affidavit claiming she was the sole manipulative mastermind behind the property inflation metrics. It was a vicious, transparent betrayal. My mother retaliated by providing the prosecution with the hidden login credentials to his offshore, undeclared Cayman Islands routing numbers. The marriage dissolved into a toxic, radioactive crater. They communicated only through hostile legal filings, draining what little money they had left on separate, bottom-tier attorneys who despised them. The sentencing hearing was brutally brief. Judge Harrison handed down an 8-year federal prison sentence for both defendants, to be served consecutively with the state's financial penalties. The financial eradication was absolute. The state seized the 5-bedroom modern farmhouse in Greenwich. It was auctioned off at a severe loss to cover partial restitution to the defrauded regional banks. The luxury SUVs were repossessed and sold at a police auction. The jet ski was seized. Every single bank account, retirement fund, and hidden asset was drained to zero. Their professional appraisal licenses were permanently revoked by the state regulatory board. Their names were blacklisted across every commercial real estate registry in the country. The country club memberships were canceled. The imported Bordeaux was permanently replaced by institutional tap water and metal trays. They became legally, financially, and socially bankrupt. They lost the house. They lost the business. They lost the cars. They lost their freedom. They lost their golden child. I closed my manila folder. I placed the silver USB drive back into my leather briefcase. I walked out of courtroom 4B. I did not look back at the defense table. I did not need to. There was nothing left there but ghosts sitting in cheap polyester. The air inside my Astoria studio apartment was still cold, but it felt remarkably different. It was 6 months after the final gavel drop. The exposed pipes still screamed when the upstairs neighbor showered. The single-barred window still looked out onto a concrete alley, but the heavy, suffocating iron block behind my sternum had completely dissolved. A stiff, cream-colored envelope was shoved under my door on a Tuesday evening. The return address was a federal correctional facility in Danbury, Connecticut. My mother's handwriting. It was shaky, uneven, a stark contrast to her usual aggressive, perfectly slanted cursive. I did not open it immediately. I let it sit on the warped plywood desk for 3 days. The fear of that paper was gone. It was just a thin sheet of processed pulp, stripped entirely of its manipulative power. When I finally sliced it open with a dull kitchen knife, the contents were predictable. A desperate, sprawling essay of self-victimization. She claimed the prison food was aggravating her imagined arterial blockages. She begged for a small deposit into her commissary account. She wrote that she forgave me for my role in her incarceration, framing my prosecution as a tragic, unavoidable misunderstanding. She ended the letter by asking if I would be willing to act as her outside legal counsel for an early parole appeal. She wanted the key to the cage she had built for herself, and she wanted me to hand it to her. I sat down at the milk crates. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy stock legal paper. I unscrewed the cap of my black ink pen. My response was not an emotional negotiation. It was a cold, impenetrable contract. I am in receipt of your correspondence dated October 12th. I am not your daughter. I am not your legal counsel. I am a senior associate at Sterling, Hayes and Vance. Do not contact this address again. Any future communication must be routed through your assigned public defender. If you wish to establish a preliminary dialogue upon your release in 8 years, you must complete the following non-negotiable prerequisites. 1. You will complete 5 consecutive years of documented, intensive psychological therapy with a state-licensed professional, focusing specifically on narcissistic personality disorder and pathological manipulation. 2. You will draft and publish a formal, signed retraction and apology letter to the Human Resources Department of every single law firm you maliciously contacted in January of 2020. 3. You will provide full, unredacted financial restitution to the victims of your commercial fraud, verified by an independent court-appointed auditor. Until these conditions are met, verified, and notarized, this door remains permanently sealed. Do not write again. I folded the paper precisely into thirds. I slid it into a blank envelope, sealed it, and dropped it into the blue USPS mailbox on the corner of 34th Street. I did not feel a rush of vindictive triumph. I felt a profound, heavy silence settle over my shoulders. The transaction was complete. The boundary was reinforced with steel and concrete. I walked back to my apartment. The sun was just beginning to set over the jagged skyline of Queens, casting long, harsh shadows across the cracked pavement. I unlocked the deadbolt. I walked into the tiny, dimly lit kitchen area. I did not celebrate with champagne. I did not call a friend to recount the victory. I turned on the rusted faucet. I let the cold water run over my hands, washing away the grit of the city subway. I reached for the cheap, chipped ceramic mug I had bought at a thrift store for 50 cents. I placed a single store-brand black tea bag inside. I filled the battered metal kettle with tap water and set it on the single functional coil of the hot plate. I stood in the silence of the room, listening to the slow, steady hiss of the heating coil. The water began to bubble, a low, comforting rumble. I watched the steam rise, curling and dissipating into the cold air. I poured the boiling water into the chipped mug. I watched the cheap tea leaves slowly bleed a dark amber color into the clear water. It was a mundane, repetitive action. But it was mine. It was a quiet, deliberate movement, entirely devoid of fear, manipulation, or survival panic. It was just a cup of tea in a quiet room, paid for by a life I had fought brutally to reclaim. The heat of the ceramic warmed the palms of my hands. I took a slow sip. If you were standing in this kitchen right now, holding this chipped mug, looking at the heavy steel door you just locked, the door separating you from the people who gave you your name, but tried to steal your future, would you ever leave the porch light on for them? Would you accept the apology if it came wrapped in genuine, agonizing work? Or is the lock permanent? Think about it carefully. Tell me where you draw the absolute line in the comments below. And if you need to hear another story of someone who survived the fire and rebuilt the house, check the description for the next case file.